first of all, welcome. As you know, I'm in New Jersey, so I was a little bit awkward with some of the using my son's computer.
Oh, look at you.
A lot of you know Jane. If you don't, she's been a huge part of social justice in Chicago. She was with the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs for over 30 years, the director for 30 years. And she's been involved in police accountability with Adam Gross for many years. This was an additional bonus I didn't know of all the connections that we have. And she's going to give us a little background and how everything fits together. Oh, I know it. Jane's mother was very involved in National Council of Jewish Women. So there's this other connection. So glad to have you.
And she's chair of the Government Guns and Violence Accountability Committee for Chicago Women Take Action.
Exactly. So
thank you, Betty.
So we've got a wonderful speaker. I don't think you need to say more. She's going to give us a little background in the context that this has been going on, police unaccountability for many, many years, and then end up with what we can do and how can we can mobilize. And as we've done for other spotlights, put your questions in the text box and we'll feed them to you, Jane, as people go along. Or we're such a small group, we might just be able to raise our hand. But anyhow, and we generally have the questions at the end. So chat box is a wonderful tool for us. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, so as you shared, so National Council of Jewish Women was the first not-for-profit I was aware of in my life. My mother was a long time, since I was a child, was active in NCJW and was involved with the Contract Buyers League before I knew what the Contract Buyers League was. As the director of JCUA, I put two and two together, but she was involved with it always. And I spent many days at NCJW thrift shops where my mom also volunteered in Highwood. On my sick days, she'd schlep me along. And so I feel very much a part and as a member of NCJW. And I also want to, where did you go, Betty? She disappeared for a minute. There you are. You didn't disappear. You're over there. So I want to also acknowledge we've been chatting, but Betty, longtime friend, and we've been in the trenches together for a very long time. And I have both the enormous love and respect. And as we're talking about these are issues that we've been working together very closely on through Chicago Women Take Action the last few years, but in the last few decades as well, as we've worked together. And so I will welcome your chiming in and insights. So I wanted to really, and each of you, and it's so good to see friends and all of you. So I want the issue of police accountability did not birth with the tragic death of George Floyd. And it did not begin with the tragic death of Laquan McDonald either in Chicago. So it's not unique to Chicago, but police killings, police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct is a national epidemic that is decades and beyond. You know, if we wanted to do a real historical analysis from the beginning of the country that has never respected people of color. But in Chicago in particular, there were a whole series of incidents that happened in abuses, police abuses, that began in 1970. And I want to share I have a PowerPoint just for us to go through and I'll try to go quickly through the historical pieces, but to give a context, because what we're dealing with when we are tackling police misconduct, police and prosecutorial misconduct, and I have to acknowledge Adam Murrow, because we've long worked together on these issues, and so the issues that we're tackling, that the recent ordinance that we're going to talk about is addressing our systemic issues in Chicago, in our political structure, in the issue, in the depth of racism in the city, and the ability of the system to the police, the protection of the police, and the fact that the police department is is a kind of a quasi public-private military part of the government that has made it so difficult to impact. And I just, parenthetically, so I took a leave from JCUA in 1986 after Harold Washington was elected in 1983, and we were all a part of trying to make that happen in our coalitions. And I was became director of community relations for Mayor Washington, and just prior to his death, so at the apex of his being mayor, and it was where he had really gathered forces and got control of the council and his greatest power. I accompanied him to, it happens, a meeting with the police. And he commented to me that all the departments that he was trying to push and reform and change and engage, the police department was the most difficult, because there was this quasi-military department protected by the Fraternal Order of Police and the union contract, which is a whole very critical aspect of our reforming the department and bringing real accountability. So this is a work in progress. We have much to do. So just to give us some background, if we can, I did something to my slideshow. What did I do? Okay. All right, so if I can let me just make this a little bit easier.
If you click slideshow.
Yeah, that'll do it. And
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So really the context of the lack of police accountability, police abuse, police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct is also tied up in the Chicago machine and the corruption of the Chicago machine, which goes way back, but as we think of it, into the 50s and 60s. And in 1970, there were Fred Hampton was assassinated. An organization called Citizen Action was formed by a woman named Mary Powers and others within Chicago communities to do something about the violent actions against communities of color, the killings that instigated enormous alarm of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and Citizen Action began questioning all these questions that we are aware of today, that we think of as coming out of, or that so many of our communities think of And I'll say it within our own Jewish community. We think of, broadly that the recent violent acts. These are not recent violent acts. These are systemic acts of racism and violence against communities of color. And citizens' action in the 1970s began to organize with communities, and actually one could challenge daily, and won some of their demands in achieving accountability sessions with the police superintendent at that time. So they felt that they got some concessions. This is Mary Powers for any of you. Betty, I don't know if I know you remember Mary. And it's not, okay, I'm sorry. So
Can I just pop in and say, Jane, at that point, that's how we got rid of Hanrahan and got
yep.
the Republican state's attorney.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Betty. And as you remember, another office that was tied into the corruption and misconduct was the office of the Cook County Coroner, who was covering up police misconduct and not investigating as they were supposed to, suspicious deaths. So the coroner's office was abolished. So again, we get a sense of progress, and this is something we must learn from. Is when we get a sense of progress, it doesn't mean progress, right? Doesn't mean that we take a breath. We can't take a breath. So the coroner's office was abolished. The office of the medical examiner was established with an advisory council that included community representatives. Another aspect of the police department at the time, and this is a whole nother context which we should talk about, was that there was a secret. This is when I came to JCUA, one of the first things I learned was that the police department had been spying on not-for-profits. And my boss, Milt Cohn, at the time was the executive director of JCUA, had a whole file, and as did so many of the organizations. And it was a Red Squad, local Red Squad. And there was a lawsuit that was brought, and the police department was forced to close this down and was ordered never to interfere with people's constitutional rights, which they did shut down the Red Squad, but actions continued. So among the wins that Citizens Action and other organizations that became part of the coalition, they won a beat rep program. They were talking about addressing the use of deadly force, talking about there were incidents, there were killings that happened with the high-speed police chases. Does this sound familiar? Into 2021, and this is, again, we're in 1970s. And there was a neutral observer program. I'm doing this because so what cases? There were cases that were addressed. There were cases of police misconduct that were reported. Citizens Alert provided legal and community support to families. There's an office that we now have that the city's set up that's called COPA, which is Office of Professional. COPA, Betty, help me. COPA is the investigative body. I'll tell you what it did rather than the acronym. COPA is today's investigative body that is charged with when there is a question of police misconduct.
I think it's Citizens Office of Police Accountability.
Thank you. Thank you. So the Citizens, what is now Citizens Office of Police Accountability, is charged with investigating police misconduct. But these offices have been in existence again since the 1970s. So the first version of what we now call COPA, it was the Office of Professional Standards. That was found to be ineffective and later, much later, the Office of Independent Police Review Authority was created. It had the same mission. And each of these offices have been charged with investigating police misconduct, but they didn't come up with a single, having investigated many incidents over the decades. There was almost no prosecution of police who, again, are very protected by the police union contract. The Fraternal Order of Police protects them even from murder, even from killings. They have been protected. And so each one of these, the series of offices, the Office of Professional Standards, Independent Police Review Authority, and now COPA, were supposed to be independent bodies, but they haven't been independent bodies. So that's our challenge. And when people will say, and the Fraternal Order of Police will say, we don't need that because we have these other bodies that are investigating. Yes, we had bodies that are investigating, but they didn't investigate and they didn't prosecute, and they were not independent. There were a couple of cases, the Appleton family, there was a racial harassment in Beverly. There was another abuse case, George Risper. So there were a couple of individual cases. But by and large, there have been no relief for communities who know without broadly, the nation today knows that there are police killings and that there are other acts of violence by the police, and particularly in communities of color, because of our cell phones. But we didn't have cell phones. So communities would report it, but nobody heard it. And if you didn't hear it, it's a tree falling in the forest. If you don't see it, it didn't happen. And that's what communities have been up against. They know very well that the incidents have been occurring, but there has been no justice. So this issue from the 1970s has been growing. There has been pushback from citizen groups, but they've been essentially made tiny steps, and the abuse has continued and continues and continues. In other cities, as we know, in Los Angeles, where there was a response after the Rodney King incident, Citizens Alert actually convened nationally with other groups around the country. So again, a coalition starts to form, groups start talking to each other nationally. What are you doing in your city? What can be done? And there were conferences, a number of conferences held to address police misconduct across the country. In 1999, I was approached by Reverend Don Benedict, who had been the longtime head of the Community Renewal Society, and Dr. Calvin Morris, who was the then head of the Community Renewal Society, saying this is a political moment that we believe that we can make inroads into getting a hold of the police and getting accountability, getting transparency, and stopping the killings. In 1999, it happened. 2 young people were killed. One, was holding a cell phone and mistaken for holding a gun. And there were 2 similar incidents, which is really what triggered our bringing together. Dr. Morris and I co-chaired the Justice Coalition of Greater Chicago, which was founded in 1999. And Adam with the ACLU and BPI were very much, and many other organizations were very much a part of working together and seeing what ordinance can we pass to get control of the police. There was a major incident with John Burge, commander on the west side of Chicago, who with a group of other police officers arrested many wrongfully, knowingly, and tortured them to make wrongful, to wrongfully state that they were guilty, and they were convicted. So many people ended up on death row who were innocent of the charges. They were tortured with electric nodes, with waterboarding, with all kinds of terrible ways that they extracted these wrongful confessions. And so the Burge case has been a notorious case that many now know about, but Burge was fired, but was allowed to retire to Florida, where he kept receiving a pension until his death. We were, the Justice Coalition was, along with others, were able to get, finally get a conviction of Burge, because he, although there was too much time had gone by in the torture, the actual tortures that the police department acknowledged that Burge was guilty of, but the prosecutors, the state's attorney, said that we couldn't get a conviction of Burge on the actual crimes that were committed because too much time had gone by. And by the way, the state's attorney at the time was Richie Daley. Was very, accountable in
And
the
Jane,
mishandling.
may I just pop in and say at this point that John Burge became the topic of discussion every single Saturday morning by Jonathan Jackson on the Saturday morning national broadcast until he was brought to trial.
Yeah. We finally, which is, and that's what it took. It took this huge coalition push, communities. We had legal, the People's Law Office went to Switzerland to bring the case so that it would get global attention. And it took all that attention for us to get him prosecuted. He finally was prosecuted and went to prison for a few years for lying on the stand. So that, because he lied within the context of the within the years that we could bring the prosecution. So that the Justice Coalition worked for a number of years, and Adam and Craig Futterman and many of the organizations, Push and our organizations, worked to get ordinances introduced to address the lack of accountability and the continuing abuses. But we didn't have those cell phones. We didn't have that video. And organizations, while working and really having come together around the issue of police, also worked in collaboration and were able to pass in Illinois to get the end of the death penalty. So the accountability, the more recent accountability movements, but we were not able to get traction. We were able to get some movement, but inordinately frustrating because there was not wide attention. And there was not wide acknowledgement, even though these issues were so well known in the communities of color who were being victimized so horrifically. But when Laquan McDonald was killed in 2014, and later it was found that there was a police cover-up and there was a release of video, then Chicago started paying attention, and the foundations actually came together. The Woods Foundation, Joyce, other foundations came together, created a fund, and actually provided support to community organizations that led to GAPA, the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, and really doing hearings and research within communities to uncover what was going on. And that's, again, I want to acknowledge Adam and the work that he's been just steadfastly doing in really playing a very important role as GAPA has pushed for police accountability. And there, over time, there were really two coalitions that formed with slightly different policies, slightly different pushes. The CPAC, the Civilian Police Accountability Council, was pushing that an independent body ought to be able to hire and fire the police superintendent, the police board, and the head of COPA. CPAC pushed that the independent oversight, and again, we saw all these other bodies that were called independent, as I mentioned, the Office of Professional Standards, IPRA, and COPA. None of these were independent, right? And so the idea of what has now resulted in the Empowering Communities for Public Safety ordinance, which has now passed, came out of many organizations and two big coalitions, the GAPA coalition, the CPAC coalition, really pushing for control of policy, of police policy, pushing for input on hiring and firing and transparency, engaging communities. And the two coalitions were in slightly different places, but were able to sit down together and resolve their differences and accommodate and create an ordinance that all of the groups would agree upon. Mayor Lightfoot, so the Chicago Women Take Action met with Lori Lightfoot before she was even candidate Lightfoot, because she was head of the mayor's task force for police accountability. And we started working on this in 2013, because again, this is not a new issue. This was an ongoing issue. We formed the Committee for Gun Violence and Police Accountability, and asked Lori to come address us in terms of what the task force's recommendations were around police accountability. And she did, and she strongly supported independent oversight, and all of those elements that the GAPA and CPAC coalitions were pushing for. But when she became mayor, she wasn't willing to give up her power, because it called for independent oversight and really civilian, strong civilian oversight of the police department, and which gives the mayor as well. It doesn't cut her out of the decision making. It doesn't cut her out of the of her role as mayor in management, but it works to ensure that there will be true independent oversight of the Chicago Police Department. Unfortunately, the mayor fought it for the last year, but the coalitions, GAPA and CPAC, worked, the aldermen and the communities worked and had actions, and finally, one by one, peeled away support and were able to come up with the ordinance with the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Act. And so it passed. It just passed July 21st. So what does it do? So it creates, the city has 22 police districts, right? We have 50 wards. We've got all these different political ways that we divide ourselves up. We have 50 wards, but we have 22 police districts. So the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Act that just passed and is now law in the city of Chicago will create district councils in each of the city's police district, and these will be elected district councils. So we will, as of it's going to take a year to phase in. So within a year from November, we will be able to vote for our district council representatives in each of our 22 police districts. So one thing that just we keep in mind that that's coming up, and that these district councils will be empowered to conduct outreach, to hold monthly hearings, to elicit community input on police policies, problems, and needed reforms. But as critically, each of the district councils, this gets complicated, so I'm going to try to not get too complicated with it. Each of the district councils are part of a process that nominates a 7-person oversight commission. And this is the commission that holds the power. So the district councils nominate persons to be the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability. And this commission has the role and responsibility to oversee the Chicago Police Department policies. The mayor can veto something that the commission puts into place as policy for the Chicago Police Department. When we talk about policy, we're thinking about things of use of force. What are the policies of use of force? How are people recruited and hired? How are people trained? What are the how do we have transparency? So many different aspects go into police department policy that ends up with people living and dying, or feeling that the police department is there to protect them, or that they are there and endangering them. So the commission will have the oversight of policy. The mayor can veto their recommended policy, and then the city council can override the mayor's veto. So there is a balance of powers involved in policy, as there should be. The commission will recommend candidates for the police superintendent and the police board to the mayor, who then must choose from the recommended candidates. A few years ago, you may remember Rahm Emanuel. There was nominees for a police superintendent that went to Mayor Emanuel at the time, and he looked at him and he said, "No, I don't like any of these," and he chose somebody else. That can't happen. That can't happen here. The commission also will hire the head of COPA, which is the body that is charged with investigating misconduct, and historically, no matter what its name has been, hasn't done so. It will now be held accountable by the commission, and the commission will hire the head of COPA, and the head of COPA the title is administrator. So the commission will directly hire the administrator of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. The commission will also be informed. There was a great deal of concern and interest as these ideas were formulating between CPAC and GAPA and others, that the undocumented communities and individuals were not represented, and how and through elections they don't vote, they don't get to vote. So how do they get representative? So one of the aspects of the ordinance is that there will be a council of undocumented persons advising the commission on issues especially impacting immigrant and undocumented communities in Chicago. The law greatly strengthens transparency of information, so we can't have any more red squads. We had a red squad, and that was abolished. But after it was abolished, of course, many things have happened under the clouds and in the dark. And there's the whole problem with officers not being free to call each other out. So transparency is a key component. And finally, the law calls for the commission to push for compliance with the federal court consent decree. And I think you had someone come in and speak to some of you were part of hearing about what the consent decree. The consent decree is that federal court agreement between the city of Chicago and the Department of Justice, and then enforced by the federal courts, because it was a process started under Obama that the city agreed to proceed with a consent decree between the federal government and between the federal government and the city of Chicago. But when Trump came in, he said, no, we don't. We're fine with the Chicago Police Department. But the city, knowing that the communities were not fine with it, said, no, we're not fine. Actually, initially, Emmanuel started negotiating with Trump, and they were going to come to a deal. And the communities pushed back, and they said, this is unacceptable. And he abandoned that idea. And there was hearings at the federal court, and a consent decree came out of those hearings, and with the force of the court, with the federal courts. And that is part of our getting accountability, is having the DOJ also pushing on issues such as use of force and hiring and whatnot. But the city's been out of compliance. So the consent decree passed in 2018, and many of us were part of testifying at that time and calling on a consent decree. But the city has been very slow to comply with what the federal courts have said it needs to do regarding use of force and police reform. So the city needs to be in compliance, and it's not. And the commission, again, can play a role there. So what can we do? You can lobby city council. So right now there's an interim. So again, the district councils will be elected, but that won't be until 2022, until the elections happen. So between now and then, the city council is going to appoint 14. I gotta get this number right. They're going to nominate 14 people for the commission. From that, they're going to give those nominations to the mayor. The mayor must pick 7 from the 14. So what can we do? We can make sure that the city council nominates 14 independent, strong candidates from which the mayor must pick from to become the first commission for our new law. When the district council elections happen, you can run for the district council. Please run for the district council. Urge friends to run for the district council. You know, we need to get strong people from across the city. We can mobilize our communities and our organizations. NCJW can do education to help people understand what the law is about and why it's important and why it will save lives. And also hopefully start to build a sense of communication and safety between the police and the communities, where there is none at this point. And finally, another element that was originally in the Empowering Communities for Public Safety Act and ordinance was that there would be a referendum, a binding referendum placed on the ballot that would say, instead of having a 7-person nominated and picked by the mayor commission, that it should be fully elected. And the referendum part was peeled off in order to get the ordinance passed. There is a separate ordinance that is now in front of the city council that we support, that if passed, and if put to the voters, and then the voters get to vote on this, would create, instead of a 7-member appointed by the mayor through a process of nominations by the district councils, would be a 7-person elected council. So we want to urge the city council. It is now in front of them. The referendum piece is now in front of them as a separate ordinance, and one that we and there is differences. There are differences between our organizations. on whether or not some support the referendum, some don't support the referendum. So I want to be completely transparent on that. So that is where we so from a time where citizens in the 1970s pushed to stop violence and the corruption deep in the police department, until 2021, 50 years later, we have passed an ordinance that had some of the language that Mary Powers in the 1970s and the communities around the city pushed for, to get relief from a very out of control police department. So we, if one sec, Betty. So, but this isn't going to work unless we get engaged. So some of the pushback around should we have, and some of Lightfoot's defense of her flip-flop, supporting it and not supporting it when she became mayor, was that, well, the police union, the FOP, is going to run for office and they're going to control the district councils. Well, this is a democracy, so that's in our hands. So the strength of our district councils, the strength of this ordinance, the ability for us to really have a strong oversight, independent oversight of policy, of hiring, of the actions and get accountability is truly in our hands. This is only going to work if we get people running and elected, who will then make up the oversight body. So it presents us that opportunity, and we need to make it happen. Betty, you were going to make a comment. You're muted.
Couple comments. One, I think someone asked about the Red Squad, and I wanted to just say there was a member of the Red Squad that came to volunteer as security for Reverend Jackson in the 70s. And he was so moved by the whole organization, what we were doing, what we really stood for. And he got to be a close friend to Reverend Jackson. And he admitted that he really was an undercover policeman working with the Red Squad that had been assigned to follow and spy on the movement, which was then went from Breadbasket to Operation Push. And he left the police department and stayed with us. He ultimately became employee and bodyguard of sorts to Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. when he actually ran for Congress. But for all of those years, initially he came in as an undercover spy for the Chicago Police Department. And no one really even suspected it because of, how supportive he was. The other thing I wanted to say, the whole Fred Hampton killing was a movement that caused the Black community then that had been solid Democratic voters to switch for that one office and vote for Bernard Carey, a Republican, for state's attorney. And that was the first time that had happened since the early 40s when African Americans were Republicans because Lincoln freed the slaves, for lack of a better way of putting it. And in the 70s, when Fred Hampton was killed, and it seemed that the state's attorney Hanrahan had some responsibility in that killing, the Black community switched on that one office and voted for a Republican in the election that year. So I just want to throw in those 2 points.
Yeah, important points. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Jane, thank you so much for the yeah, for enlightening us. I mean, just this history is still so astounding. I've got one more question here. I'm going to ask you to just send me the slide with what we can do. And I'm going to send this out not until next week when I'm back home, but and we'll figure out ways to work with some of our coalition partners to get this in.
Yeah.
I have a comment from Merle Gross, but we continue to elect and re-elect persons of questionable quality, not thoughtful enough, not studious enough, perhaps not literate enough to understand some of the laws they pass. An elected politician's prime focus is to get reelected. Yeah. So education is our big entree into getting this changed.
Yeah.
Could I make one other point, Jane, about Mayor Lightfoot? She was fighting against this, against
let Betty finish.
Against GAPA and CPAC, and her reasoning for it, which is Jane has made such an important point. Her reasoning was that the police would take over the leadership in the various districts, that the police department would pick the people who would run, and then the police department would ultimately be running ECPS. And that is not necessarily true, but it was more important what Jane said about us or someone we know running for those offices in the districts.
Earl?
Which is why we should never put people on the ballot to be elected. We keep electing questionable judges, questionable legislators for state, and for our civic government.
Well, so the strength of this law.
Wait, which law? The one that you are proposing?
Strength of the law, with the strength of the Empowering Communities for Public Safety ordinance, which just passed.
Yeah.
July 21. The strength of that is based on our district council elections.
And
And
you're countering that, Jane. That's what I don't understand.
Yeah.
You're now saying that people should be on the ballot.
no, well, the district council will be on the ballot. People running for the district council positions are going to be elected. So that's the law that was just passed, Merle.
Right.
And that's what we have to strongly urge good people all over
Correct.
the city.
Agreed. But you had an added thing.
Well, that I mentioned. So let me address that first, because otherwise I think it would be very confusing.
No, I agree with that.
So
That's fine.
Well, those are people on the ballot who we will be electing. So it is in each of the 22 districts. So that's critical. There is the additional element that Merle is raising. This was a key contention between the two coalitions. So and what was necessary in terms of the coalitions coming together and trying to find common ground was the added element, the additional element of instead of the district councils then coming together and creating a nominating process for the commission, that the commission be directly elected. So that's the initial agreement between both coalitions was that was going to be a referendum was going to be put to all of us. That because there were a difference of opinion. So that the resolution was, let's put it to the public and let's have a public debate about, we have the district councils being elected. There's a difference of opinion among the police accountability groups as to whether or not the commission should be nominated or elected. And a referendum, the question of the referendum, the referendum won't getting the referendum on the ballot isn't the decision. The decision will be the public's decision whether or not to vote for it or not. So the question is to have that debate. Betty? And let me just, my friend, let me just make sure if we have other folks who questions, comments.
We don't have any other questions in the chat box.
I wanted to raise a point and then make a comment. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in each individual district, only the people who live in that district will be able to vote for those
Right.
people for that
That's right.
particular district. It won't be a citywide or countywide thing. Each district will be separate. And one of the good things about that, I always use sub-circuits as an example of what that could mean. In the county of Cook, until the law was changed and sub-circuits were created, we had very little chance of electing African-American judges simply because they had to run countywide. And the chances of anyone who didn't have an Irish last name winning were between slim and none. And now that we have sub-circuits, you have to live in Hyde Park to run in the 5th sub-circuit and get elected as a judge. So chances of someone living in Bronzeville not being African-American and running for judge are like between slim and none. And those sub-circuits are all across. It will also enable more women to be elected as judges. And so I use the sub-circuits as an example of what happens when you get to vote in your own district. Cook County commissioners used to all be elected countywide until they turned it into districts so that you got commissioners that look like you in your district. So when it's done by district, it makes a big difference.
If I could, I'd like to make a comment. When local school councils first came in, there were a lot of people who ran. And because there were so many, only those who happened to do a lot of campaigning were able to win. And I think the danger is, or the concern, let me not be so negative, is that in the district council, you're going to elect 3 people. How many people are going to run? If too many people run, and some of those people are in fact part of the FOP, and they do a lot of campaigning, they may be elected. So what we ended up doing with our local school council was essentially slating. So we would have a certain, have people that whoever we are, wanted to get into that and keep the person who we didn't want from getting in. So it's not as simple as saying everybody should run, because that dilutes it if there's one strong person or 2 strong people who really want to get in and they campaign. So
that's what I ended up doing down in what was commonly called the Ickies. It's a housing development at 22nd Street. And the people in Dearborn Park did not want these local school council members to come from that area. They wanted them all from Dearborn Park. And I was campaign manager for a slate that included 2001 Michigan, the Ickies, and our representative who was not a member, who was not, didn't have children in school. One of them was a former member of the Chicago Chicago Public School Board. And we ended up, because we campaigned, I knew how to campaign. We got buses of parents who lived in the Ickies and took them to vote, and they beat it. And they had us on TV. The Sun-Times, everybody did stories because we won that election just based on campaigning, not with money, not with popularity, but with getting out the vote.
Well, what we ended up doing at the high school that I was involved in is we did that the second time around because of what happened the first time around, when someone was elected whose goal was to oust the principal.
So
anyway, it's just something to keep in mind when you say.
It's a great idea.
And Paul, as Paula mentions, the FOP is going to be looking for their money and dark money and whatever monies that they can. This is our democracy. So we are taking responsibility and saying that we are going to mobilize. We need to raise the money. We need to counter their money. And we need to do what everything. We need to be smart and organized. There's an opportunity here, and Merle, Adam and I have had these conversations of another positive outcome of this law, and the fact that we need to now run 22 elections in 22 districts. So another positive outcome that we can be cognizant of is that these are opportunities also for us to organize and mobilize communities, and not just around. So we're going to be organizing around police accountability. We're going to be organizing around the district councils, but there are also resources, and the fact that there was a GAPA, the fact that there was a CPAC, in part came out of the fact that there were monies on our side that mobilized, saying that there has to be police accountability. And part of our opportunity is then to reach out to resources and saying, you wanted to see police accountability, and we've got it. Now you've got to still be with us. Now we need those resources. We got those resources and did our due diligence and did our research and got the law passed. Now those resources have got to be there for us to have fair and free and strong elections. And that's, that is part of our organizing. This isn't just going to happen. And if we just sit back and say, we got the law, now it's just going to happen, and you go run for office, but I've got other things to do, then we're in trouble. And so we need to not be in trouble. We need to take this opportunity and through our messy democracy, make our oversight a strong oversight that Harold would be proud of.
Yes. Thank you again. I mean, I think we're bursting with ideas and what can we do and questions and how are we going to mobilize? So we'll be in touch.
Well, I love having that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you. Again, NCJW is deep in my heart. We have to work together. Yes. So I know on behalf of Chicago Women Take Action and Betty and
I'm a member of NCJW.
Yeah, Jane.
Yeah, I know.
I'm a very member now.
Jane, you got to be a member too, Jane.
I am a member, and my daughter's a member.
That's great.
I am a lifetime member.
We all have to belong to everything and to work together.
Yeah, so we do. But from a coalition, then we think about, okay, what are all the organizations that we have our hands on? What are the congregations? What are the constituencies? What are the churches? What are the mosques? What are those groups that we have hands on? And we have to grow that, grow the relationship. And yeah, the League of Women Voters is obviously.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Let me briefly read Martha Becker. Everyone's wondering who she is. She's joined us as a learning experience that the NCJW Jacksonville Academy Group wants to work with a coalition with other groups. She's also taking a citizen police class, and the chief used Chicago as a derogatory system place and was talking about his accountability system. And then her uncle, Joe Kelman, worked in Chicago.
Oh, I knew Joe Kelman.
Okay, no, that's Martha. She lived in Miami there and in Jacksonville, Florida. So she's saying thank you for your program, for doing this.
Oh my goodness.
Spreading the word.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Jane, you did a magnificent
Yes.
job. I learned so much. It was, I've only lived here 5 years, so the long history was so helpful to me. Amazing.
So I hope that was, so I really appreciate that, Jen. I just think it's very important for us to understand because what we are up against. So what we are up against is something that is really deep and really old.
And corruption runs the game here, really.
Right. And there have been these methodical efforts to do something about it. And we now have that opportunity.
Thank you for.
So thank you. Thank you all very much.
It was fantastic.
Yeah, this is terrific. And don't forget the next spotlights and the 25th and the 28th. March on voting. So lots going on. Jane, this is just fabulous.
Thank you.
And it's recorded, so we'll have lots of people will be able to see it.